Good afternoon all. I am continuing my video lecture series based upon database management system. Now the next video is on deadlock and then transaction recovery. In the multiple process systems, deadlock is an unwanted situation that arises in the shared resource environment where a process indefinitely waits for the resources that is held by another process. For example, assumes a set of instructions T0 to Tn. T0 needs a resource X to complete its task. The resource X is held by T1 and then T1 is waiting for the resource Y which is held by T2. T2 is waiting for resources Z which is held by T0. Thus all the processes wait for each other to release resources. In this situation, none of the processes can finish their task. This situation is called as deadlock. Deadlock is not healthy for a system. In case a system is stuck in a deadlock, the transaction involved in the deadlock are either rollback or restarted. Let us have an example here. For understanding the concepts of deadlock, suppose the transaction T1 holds a lock on some row in the student table and needs to update some rows in the grade table simultaneously. T2 holds locks on those very low rows which T1 needs to update in the grade table but needs to update the rows in the student table held by transaction 1. Now the main problems arise. Transaction T1 will wait for transaction 2 to give up the lock and similar. Transaction T2 will wait for transaction T1 that gives up the lock. As a consequence, all activities comes to the halt stage and remains at standstill. However, unless the database DBMS detects the deadlock and abort one of the transactions. For T1, students will be transaction 1 and then grade will be on transaction 2. If transaction 1 requests for grade, the transaction 2 is request for student, they both will be hold on that stage. Deadlock avoidance. When a database is stuck in a deadlock, it is always better to avoid the deadlock rather than restarting or aborting the database. The deadlock avoidance method is suitable for smaller database, whereas the deadlock prevention method is suitable for larger database. One method of avoiding deadlock is using application consistent logic. In the above example, transaction that assess students and grades should always assess this table in the same order. In the scenario describes that transaction T1 simply wait for transaction T2 to release the lock on grades before it begins. When transaction T2 releases the lock, T1 can proceed freely. Another method for avoiding deadlock is to apply both the row level locking mechanisms and the read committed is isolation levels. However, it does not guarantee to remove deadlock completely. Deadlock detections. When a transaction waits indefinitely to obtain a lock, the database management system should detect whether the transaction is involved in a deadlock or not. Wait for graph is one of the methods for detecting deadlock situations. This method is suitable for smaller database. In this method, a graph is drawn based on the transaction and its lock on the resources. If the graph created has a closed loop or a cycle, then there is a deadlock. For above mentioned scenario, the wait for graph is drawn below. Wait for lock R1, wait for lock R2. Where T1 is wait for lock R1, then T2 wait for lock R2 will be the deadlock situations. Deadlock prevention is for large database. The deadlock prevention method is suitable. The deadlock can be prevented if the resources are allocated in such a way. Then the deadlock never occurs. The DBMS analyzes the operations whether they can create a deadlock situation or not. If they do, the transaction is never allowed to be executed. The following table lists with the difference between wait die and wound wait scheme, etc. Wait die and wound die. It is based on non-primitive techniques. It is based on primitive techniques. In this, older transaction must wait for younger one to release its data items. The older transaction never wait for younger transactions. The number of abort and rollback is higher in these techniques. In this, the number of abort and rollback is lesser. Deadlock avoidance is when a database is stuck in a deadlock. It is always better to avoid the deadlock rather than restarting or aborting the database. The deadlock avoidance method is suitable for smaller database, whereas the deadlock prevention method is suitable for large database. One method of avoiding deadlock is using application consistent logic. We are having an example for transaction that assess students and grade sheet from the table in the same order. Thank you.